In the small town of Ridgewood, Mississippi, where life moved at a slow pace and traditions ran deep, an extraordinary event unfolded one humid summer morning. The local courthouse, a weathered brick building with ivy creeping up its walls, stood as a silent witness to decades of human drama. On this particular day, however, something unusual was about to happen, something that would leave an indelible mark on everyone present. The courtroom buzzed with activity as people filed in, taking their seats on creaky wooden benches. Lawyers shuffled papers, clerks adjusted their glasses, and reporters scribbled notes in anticipation of what promised to be a routine property dispute case. At the center of it all sat Mr. Elijah Johnson, an elderly black man whose presence seemed both unassuming and commanding. Dressed in a faded but neatly pressed suit, Elijah leaned slightly on his polished cane, his eyes scanning the room with quiet determination. Elijah's story began long before this day. Born into a family of farmers, he had grown up working alongside his parents and grandparents on a modest plot of land nestled on the outskirts of Ridgewood. This land wasn't just soil and trees, it was a legacy, a testament to generations of struggle, resilience, and hope. His grandfather had purchased the property after emancipation, saving every penny earned through backbreaking labor under the scorching southern sun. Over the years, the Johnsons had faced threats, discrimination, and countless challenges, yet they held on to the land with unwavering resolve. It was more than property. It was a symbol of freedom, identity, and survival. But now that very land was at risk. A group of developers had appeared out of nowhere, armed with documents claiming ownership of the property. According to them, the land rightfully belonged to their company due to ancient deeds and legal loopholes. To make matters worse, these developers were backed by influential figures in the community, including politicians and business leaders who saw the land as prime real estate for expansion. They argued that progress demanded sacrifice, conveniently ignoring the history and humanity tied to the soil. For Elijah, this wasn't just a legal battle, it was personal. Every inch of that land carried memories, the laughter of children playing beneath the oak tree, the smell of fresh corn harvested during harvest season, and the sound of hymns sung by his grandmother while she worked in the fields. Losing it would mean losing a part of himself, his family, and everything they had fought so hard to preserve. Yet, as he looked around the crowded courtroom, he couldn't help but feel like David facing Goliath. The other side was represented by sharp-tongued lawyers dressed in expensive suits carrying thick folders filled with official-looking papers. Meanwhile, Elijah sat alone, without a high-powered attorney or flashy presentations to bolster his case. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as people speculated about how the trial would unfold. Whispers echoed off the walls. "He doesn't stand a chance. They'll eat him alive. Why bother fighting? He's just an old man." Some chuckled softly, amused by the apparent mismatch between the two sides. Even the judge, a stern-looking woman in her late 50s, seemed skeptical as she glanced at Elijah over her reading glasses. No one doubted the outcome, after all. How could a simple farmer possibly compete against corporate giants with unlimited resources? Despite the dismissive attitudes surrounding him, Elijah remained composed. He didn't flinch when the opposing counsel confidently laid out their arguments, citing laws, precedents, and technicalities designed to overwhelm anyone unfamiliar with legal jargon. Instead, he listened intently, nodding occasionally as if piecing together a puzzle in his mind. There was something striking about his demeanor, a quiet strength that defied the mockery and condescension directed toward him. While others might have crumbled under the weight of such opposition, Elijah seemed unfazed, almost serene. What no one realized was that Elijah carried within him a lifetime of wisdom and experience. He understood the value of patience, the importance of timing, and the power of truth. As the proceedings dragged on, he let the opposing side build their elaborate case, secure in their belief that victory was inevitable. But Elijah knew better. Beneath his calm exterior lay a fire fueled by years of injustice, love for his family, and an unshakable faith in doing what was right. And though no one could see it yet, He was preparing to deliver a response that would silence the skeptics and challenge the very foundation of their assumptions. As the first part of the trial drew to a close, the tension in the room was palpable. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that something significant was brewing beneath the surface. Little did they know, the old black man sitting quietly at the defendant's table was about to turn the entire narrative upside down, and nothing would ever be the same again. As the courtroom settled into a tense silence, the opposing counsel stood confidently at the podium ready to present their case. The lead attorney, Mr. Richard Holloway, was known for his sharp wit and unrelenting style of argumentation. With a stack of papers in one hand and a smug smile on his face, he began laying out his case against Elijah Johnson. His words were precise, calculated, and delivered with an air of superiority that made it clear he believed this trial was already won. Holloway started by outlining the history of the disputed land, presenting documents that dated back over a century. He explained how his clients had traced the property's title to its original owner, a wealthy plantation owner who had supposedly sold the land decades ago. According to Holloway, the paperwork proved beyond doubt that the developers were the rightful owners. "This is not just a matter of law," he declared, pacing back and forth in front of the judge, "but a matter of facts. Facts don't lie," he continued, citing legal precedents and quoting statutes as if reciting poetry. Each sentence seemed designed to intimidate anyone listening, especially Elijah. Holloway gestured dramatically toward the elderly man sitting quietly at the defendant's table. "My esteemed colleague here has no formal training in law," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "And while we respect his dedication to his family's legacy, sentimentality cannot override the rule of law. A few people in..." The audience chuckled nervously, glancing at Elijah as if expecting him to crumble under the weight of such authority. But Elijah didn't flinch. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on his cane. His expression remained calm, almost serene, as though he were listening to a distant storm rather than a direct attack on his character and livelihood. Those who observed him closely noticed something remarkable. There was no fear in his eyes, only quiet resolve. It was as if he knew something no one else did, a secret weapon waiting to be revealed. When it came time for Elijah to respond, the atmosphere shifted, ever so slightly. The judge turned her attention to him, raising an eyebrow expectantly. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice neutral but firm, "would you like to address the court?" For a moment, Elijah didn't move. Then, slowly, deliberately, he rose from his chair. Every eye in the room followed him as he adjusted his glasses and took a deep breath. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic flourish, just the steady presence of a man who had lived through far worse than this. Elijah began, speaking in a soft, measured tone that carried across the room despite its lack of volume. At first, some people leaned forward, unsure of what to expect. Others exchanged skeptical glances, wondering if he would stumble over legal terms or lose his composure. But Elijah didn't dive into legalese or try to match Holloway's polished rhetoric. Instead, he told a story, a deeply personal one. "Want to tell you about my grandfather," he began, his voice tinged with emotion but never wavering. "He was born into slavery, right here in Mississippi. When freedom came, he didn't waste a single day. He worked harder than any man I've ever known, not because he had to, but because he wanted to give his children a better life. He saved every penny he earned, sometimes going without food just so he could buy this land." As he spoke, Elijah's words painted vivid images of hardship and determination. He described how his grandfather had walked miles to work odd jobs, endured racism and violence, and fought tirelessly to secure a piece of earth he could call his own. The courtroom fell silent. Even Holloway stopped scribbling notes, momentarily caught off guard by the raw sincerity in Elijah's voice. The old man went on, sharing stories of his parents and their struggles to hold on to the land during Jim Crow-era discrimination. They faced threats, intimidation, even arson, he said, his voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. But they refused to let go. They taught me that this land isn't just dirt and trees. It's a promise kept across lifetimes. Elijah paused, looking around the room. His gaze lingered on the judge, then moved to the jury, the lawyers, and finally the spectators. You can look at papers and numbers, he continued, but you cannot measure the weight of blood, sweat, and tears. This land holds the memory of my ancestors. It holds the dreams of my grandchildren. And I will not stand by and let someone take it away based on documents that may have been forged or manipulated during times when justice wasn't blind, it was bought. His words struck a chord. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the truth behind them. Elijah wasn't arguing technicalities or challenging the validity of the documents directly. Instead, he was appealing to something deeper: morality, humanity, and the shared understanding of what it means to fight for what is rightfully yours. He spoke of systemic injustices, pointing out how laws had historically been used to disenfranchise black families like his. Paperwork can be changed, he said, his voice rising slightly, but history cannot. My family's history is written in the soil of this land, and no document can erase that. By the time Elijah finished speaking, the mood in the courtroom had transformed completely. The initial laughter and dismissive attitudes were gone, replaced by a profound sense of reflection. Some people wiped away tears, moved by the depth of his testimony. Others exchanged uneasy glances, realizing too late that they had underestimated this unassuming man. Even Holloway appeared shaken, fumbling with his notes as if searching for a rebuttal, but none came. Elijah's words had pierced through the legal jargon and exposed the human side of the issue, making it impossible to ignore. The judge, visibly affected, announced a short recess before continuing with the proceedings. As people filed out of the courtroom, murmurs filled the hallways. Reporters scrambled to capture reactions, sensing that this trial was no longer just about property rights. It had become a symbol of resilience and justice. For many, Elijah's speech served as a wake-up call, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about history, privilege, and fairness. Back inside the courtroom, Elijah returned to his seat, leaning heavily on his cane. Though physically exhausted, there was a spark in his eyes, a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the tide was turning in his favor. Little did he know, his words had already begun to ripple outward, sparking conversations and debates that would extend far beyond the confines of the courthouse. The battle was far from over, but Elijah had planted a seed, one that would grow into something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. When the recess ended and everyone returned to their seats, the courtroom felt different. The earlier dismissive energy had dissipated, replaced by an air of anticipation. People whispered among themselves, their voices softer now, as if afraid to disturb the gravity of what had just transpired. Reporters huddled in corners, scribbling furiously into notebooks or typing updates on their phones. Even the lawyers for the opposing side seemed less confident, their usual swagger tempered by Elijah's unexpected eloquence. The judge called the court back to order, her gavel striking the wooden block with a sharp crack. She turned to Mr. Richard Holloway, giving him permission to continue presenting his case. But something about Holloway's demeanor had shifted. Gone was the cocky bravado he'd displayed earlier. Instead, he appeared cautious, almost defensive. Picking up where he left off, he resumed citing legal precedents and technicalities, but his arguments lacked the same punch. His words felt hollow, like they were bouncing off the walls without making an impact. Elijah sat quietly, watching Holloway pace back and forth. He didn't interrupt, nor did he show any sign of frustration. Instead, there was a calmness about him, a quiet confidence that unnerved even the most seasoned observers. It was as though he knew the truth carried more weight than any law book. When Holloway finally finished speaking, the room fell silent once again. The judge glanced at Elijah, signaling it was his turn to respond. This time, Elijah rose without hesitation. There was no fumbling, no nervousness, just the steady poise of someone who had lived through far worse than this. Adjusting his glasses, he looked directly at the jury, then at the judge, before addressing the entire courtroom. "I'm not here to argue documents," he began, his voice firm yet gentle. "Documents can be forged, signatures can be faked, laws can be twisted, but one thing cannot be changed: the truth." He went on to explain how the disputed land had been passed down through generations of his family, each transfer documented carefully, not with fancy papers, but with trust, love, and sacrifice. "My grandfather didn't need seals or stamps to prove ownership," Elijah said, leaning slightly on his cane for support. "He proved it with his labor, his blood, and his life. This land is ours because we earned it, not because someone wrote our name on a piece of paper." Then, Elijah took a bold step. He challenged the authenticity of the documents presented by the developers. Without raising his voice, he pointed out inconsistencies in the dates and signatures, suggesting they might have been altered during eras when black families were routinely cheated out of their property. "Why do these papers suddenly appear now?" he asked, his tone calm but piercing. "Where were they 50 years ago or 20 years ago? Why are they surfacing only when developers see dollar signs?" His questions hung in the air, unanswered. Holloway shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly unprepared for this line of reasoning. The opposing counsel had relied heavily on the complexity of legal language to overwhelm Elijah, but Elijah had sidestepped all of that. He wasn't debating technicalities, he was appealing to common sense and fairness. And it was working. As Elijah continued, he shared anecdotes that painted a vivid picture of the systemic injustices faced by black landowners throughout history. He spoke of sharecropping contracts designed to trap families in debt, of discriminatory lending practices that made it nearly impossible to secure loans, and of outright theft disguised as legal transactions. "For every acre my family owns today," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "there are 10 more that were stolen from us, stolen through lies, violence, and laws written to protect the powerful." The audience listened intently, hanging onto every word. Some nodded in agreement, others wiped away tears, and a few shifted uncomfortably in their seats, forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Even the judge leaned forward, her expression unreadable but undeniably engaged. Elijah's testimony wasn't just about his land. It was about centuries of struggle, resilience, and survival. It was about reclaiming dignity in a system that had long sought to deny it. Finally, Elijah concluded with a statement that silenced the room. "You can take away our homes, our farms, even our lives," he said, his voice trembling with conviction, "but you cannot take away our spirit. We have fought for this land, not for greed, but for justice, not for profit, but for legacy. If you rule against me today, fine, but know this: I will fight for this land until my last breath, because it is not mine alone. It belongs to those who came before me and those who will come after." When Elijah finished speaking, the courtroom erupted into murmurs. People exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding in admiration. Holloway tried to mount a rebuttal, but his words sounded feeble compared to Elijah's impassioned plea. For the first time, it became clear that this trial wasn't just about property rights. It was about morality, humanity, and the enduring power of truth. After both sides rested their cases, the judge announced that she would need time to review the evidence before delivering her verdict. As the courtroom emptied, reporters swarmed around Elijah, peppering him with questions. How did he prepare for this? What inspired his speech? Did he really think he could win? Elijah answered patiently, his responses simple but profound. "I didn't prepare anything special," he admitted. "I just told the truth. The rest is up to God." Outside the courthouse, a small crowd gathered, many of them locals who had come to support Elijah. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers patted him on the back, offering words of encouragement. Someone handed him a cup of coffee, another offered to drive him home. Despite the uncertainty of the outcome, Elijah felt a sense of peace. He had done everything he could, and that was enough. News of the trial spread quickly. Local newspapers ran headlines like "Old Farmer Stuns Courtroom with Emotional Plea" and "David versus Goliath in Mississippi Land Dispute." Social media buzzed with reactions as people across the country weighed in on the case. Some praised Elijah's courage and wisdom, while others criticized the developers for attempting to exploit historical injustices. Online petitions popped up, urging the court to rule in Elijah's favor. Supporters organized fundraisers to help cover legal expenses, though Elijah insisted he didn't need charity, only justice. Back at his farm, Elijah returned to his daily routine, tending to his crops and feeding his animals. Life went on as usual, but the trial lingered in his mind. He thought about his ancestors, wondering what they would say if they could see him now. Would they be proud? Would they tell him to keep fighting? He imagined them standing beside him, their spirits, guiding him through the storm. Days turned into weeks as the community waited anxiously for the judge's decision. In the meantime, Elijah's story continued to inspire. Schools invited him to speak to students about perseverance and integrity. Churches asked him to share his testimony during Sunday sermons. Community leaders rallied around the cause, using the trial as a catalyst to address broader issues of racial inequality and land rights. Elijah, who had always preferred a quiet life, found himself thrust into the spotlight, but he embraced it gracefully, knowing his voice could make a difference. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over his fields, Elijah stood at the edge of his property. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the whispers of generations past. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of their sacrifices and the strength of their dreams. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain. This land would always belong to his family, not because of papers or courts, but because of the unbreakable bond between people and the earth they call home. The day of the verdict arrived, and the Ridgewood courthouse was packed to capacity. People from all walks of life had gathered, farmers in worn boots, students clutching notebooks, reporters with cameras slung around their necks, and even a few curious tourists who had heard about the trial through news outlets. The air buzzed with anticipation as everyone waited for Judge Marlene Thompson to deliver her ruling. Her reputation for fairness preceded her, but no one could predict how she would rule in such a complex and emotionally charged case. Elijah entered the courtroom quietly, dressed in the same faded suit he'd worn throughout the trial. His presence commanded respect, not because of his appearance, but because of the quiet dignity he exuded. As he took his seat, supporters exchanged hopeful glances, while others held their breath, bracing themselves for whatever came next. On the opposite side, the developers' team sat stiffly, their confidence visibly shaken after Elijah's powerful testimony. When Judge Thompson finally called the court to order, the room fell silent. She adjusted her glasses, glanced at the thick stack of documents before her, and began speaking in a measured tone. "This case," she said, pausing briefly to survey the room, "is not merely a dispute over property rights. It is a reflection of history, morality, and the enduring struggle for justice." Her words sent a ripple through the audience, signaling that this decision would be far more than a simple legal formality. She went on to acknowledge the arguments presented by both sides. For the developers, she noted the technical validity of their documents and the importance of upholding legal processes. But then, her focus shifted to Elijah's testimony. "Mr. Johnson has reminded us of something vital, that laws exist to serve humanity, not the other way around," she declared, her voice steady but impassioned. "While paperwork may provide evidence of ownership, it cannot erase the legacy of blood, sweat, and sacrifice embedded in this land." As she continued, her reasoning became clear. After carefully reviewing the historical context and the inconsistencies in the developers' documents, Judge Thompson ruled in favor of Elijah. The courtroom erupted into cheers, applause, and even tears. Supporters rushed to embrace Elijah, congratulating him on his victory. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, snapping photos and shouting questions. Meanwhile, the developers' lawyers sat in stunned silence, their faces pale with disbelief. For Elijah, the moment was bittersweet. He had won the battle, but the war against systemic injustice was far from over. As people celebrated around him, he remained grounded, knowing that his fight symbolized something larger than himself. When a reporter asked how he felt about the verdict, Elijah simply replied, "I'm grateful, but this isn't just my win. It's a win for every family who has ever been told they don't belong on their own land." In the days following the trial, Elijah's story spread like wildfire. National news networks picked up the tale, framing it as a modern-day David versus Goliath narrative. Social media platforms lit up with hashtags like Justice for Elijah and On Landis Legacy, sparking conversations about racial inequality, land rights, and the need for reform in property law. Elijah's name became synonymous with resilience, inspiring countless individuals to stand up for what they believed in no matter the odds. Locally, the impact was equally profound. Community leaders organized meetings to discuss ways to protect vulnerable landowners from predatory practices. Legal aid clinics offered free consultations to families facing similar disputes, ensuring they wouldn't have to fight alone. Schools incorporated Elijah's story into their curriculums, teaching students about perseverance, integrity, and the power of truth. Churches held prayer services in his honor, praising him as a beacon of hope in troubled times. Despite the newfound attention, Elijah remained humble. He returned to his farm, tending to his crops and living the simple life he cherished. Yet he couldn't ignore the letters that began pouring in from strangers across the country. Some thanked him for giving them courage. Others shared their own stories of loss and struggle, seeking advice or solace. Moved by these messages, Elijah decided to use his platform to make a difference. He started visiting schools, community centers, and churches, sharing his experiences and encouraging others to value their heritage. At each event, he emphasized the importance of standing firm in one's convictions, even when faced with overwhelming opposition. Change doesn't always come from loud voices or grand gestures, he often said. Sometimes it comes from standing quietly in your truth and refusing to back down. His words resonated deeply, especially among young people eager to create a better future. One particularly memorable visit took place at Ridgewood High School, where students greeted Elijah with a standing ovation. A teenage girl named Maya approached him after his speech, tears streaming down her face. "My family lost our home to foreclosure last year," she confessed. "We didn't know what to do. Hearing your story makes me believe we can still fight for what's right." Elijah placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, offering words of encouragement. "You're stronger than you think," he told her. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As months passed, Elijah's influence grew beyond the borders of Ridgewood. Invitations poured in from neighboring towns and cities, asking him to speak at rallies, conferences, and fundraisers. Though age had slowed him physically, his spirit burned brighter than ever. He traveled whenever possible, spreading his message of hope and resilience. Along the way, he inspired a new generation of activists determined to address systemic injustices head-on. Back home, Elijah continued to nurture his land, which now carried even greater significance. Every tree, every blade of grass seemed imbued with renewed purpose. Visitors often stopped by to thank him personally, leaving small tokens of appreciation, a basket of fresh fruit, a handmade quilt, or a heartfelt note. Elijah accepted these gifts graciously, always reminding people that the real reward lay in coming together as a community. Yet, despite the accolades and admiration, Elijah never sought fame or recognition. What mattered most to him was the knowledge that he had made a difference not just for himself, but for countless others who might never have the chance to tell their stories. In quiet moments, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here, the sacrifices of his ancestors, the hardships endured by his parents, and the lessons passed down through generations. All of it had led to this moment, a testament to the enduring power of love, faith, and determination. Late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah stood at the edge of his fields, gazing out at the golden expanse bathed in twilight. The wind carried the scent of earth and leaves, mingling with the faint sound of crickets chirping in the distance. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes, imagining the voices of those who had walked this land before him. Their whispers filled the air, urging him to keep going, to keep fighting, not just for today, but for tomorrow. When he opened his eyes again, the world felt a little brighter. Elijah smiled softly, leaning on his cane as he turned to walk back toward the house. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't face them alone. Together, with his family, his community, and the countless lives he had touched, he would continue to build a legacy rooted in truth, justice, and unwavering hope. And so the story of the old black man who silenced a courtroom became more than a memory. It became a movement, a call to action for generations to come. Months had passed since the trial, and Elijah Johnson's life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. The small farmhouse on the outskirts of Ridgewood, once a quiet refuge, now felt like a hub of activity. Strangers came from near and far to meet him, seeking advice, inspiration, or simply a moment of connection with the man whose courage had reignited hope for so many. Yet despite the constant flow of visitors, Elijah remained grounded. He woke each morning at dawn, drank his coffee on the porch, and tended to his fields as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had happened. Something that rippled far beyond the borders of Mississippi. Elijah's story transcended headlines and hashtags, becoming a catalyst for change across the nation. Communities embroiled in similar battles over land rights began organizing themselves, drawing strength from his example. In Alabama, a group of farmers banded together to challenge predatory lending practices. In Georgia, descendants of sharecroppers filed lawsuits to reclaim ancestral lands stolen under dubious circumstances. And in Chicago, urban activists used Elijah's narrative to highlight disparities in property ownership within marginalized neighborhoods. His name became synonymous with resilience, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, truth and perseverance could prevail. Elijah didn't seek out this role, it found him. Letters arrived daily, some typed neatly, others scrawled hastily on scraps of paper. Many were from families fighting to hold onto their homes or farms, desperate for guidance. Others came from students inspired by his courage, asking how they could make a difference in their own communities. Elijah read every letter carefully, responding to as many as he could. His replies were always thoughtful, often beginning with a simple acknowledgement of the writer's struggle. "I hear you," he would write, "and I see you." One such letter came from a young woman named Tanya, who lived in rural Louisiana. Her family had owned a small plot of land for generations, but developers were circling, armed with offers too good to refuse, or so they claimed. Tanya wrote to Elijah, unsure of what to do. Should they sell? Fight? Give up? Elijah invited her to visit, promising no easy answers but offering a listening ear. When she arrived, weary-eyed and uncertain, he greeted her warmly, ushering her into his kitchen. Over plates of homemade biscuits and fried chicken, he listened intently as she poured out her heart. When she finished speaking, Elijah nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," he said, "the hardest part isn't deciding what to do, it's believing you have the right to decide at all." He went on to explain how his own journey had taught him the value of standing firm, even when everyone else doubted you. "Don't let fear silence your voice," he advised. "Your land is more than dirt and trees. It's a piece of your soul. Protect it, not just for yourself but for those who will come after you." Tanya left Ridgewood with renewed determination, vowing to fight for her family's legacy. Months later, she sent Elijah an update. The developers had backed off thanks to a coalition of local advocates rallying around her cause. Enclosed with the letter was a photograph of Tanya standing proudly beside her parents on their land. Elijah pinned it to the bulletin board above his desk, adding it to a growing collection of stories sparked by his own. As word of Elijah's advocacy spread, invitations to speak at larger events began pouring in. Universities wanted him to deliver commencement speeches. Civil rights organizations requested keynote addresses at their annual conferences. Even political figures reached out, hoping to align themselves with his grassroots movement. While Elijah accepted some invitations, he declined others, wary of being co-opted by agendas that didn't align with his values. To him, this wasn't about politics or fame. It was about people. Real people with real struggles, fighting to preserve what mattered most. One event stood out among the rest: the National Land Justice Summit held in Atlanta. Hundreds of attendees packed the auditorium, eager to hear from leaders working to address systemic inequities in property ownership. When Elijah took the stage, the crowd erupted into applause, rising to their feet in a standing ovation. For a moment he stood there, leaning on his cane, visibly moved by the outpouring of support. Then, with a gentle wave, he motioned for everyone to sit down. "I'm not here to give you answers," he began, his voice steady yet warm. "I don't pretend to know the solution to every problem we face, but I do know this: none of us are alone. We're connected, not just by our struggles, but by our dreams. Dreams of fairness, dreams of dignity, dreams of leaving something better for the next generation." As he spoke, he shared anecdotes from his travels, highlighting the resilience of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. There was Maria, a Latina mother in Texas who organized her neighborhood to resist gentrification. There was James, a Native American elder leading efforts to reclaim tribal lands lost to broken treaties. And there was Kwame, a young activist in Detroit using art to raise awareness about housing discrimination. Each story underscored a central theme: collective action. No one wins alone, Elijah emphasized. We need each other. Whether it's sharing resources, amplifying voices, or simply showing up when someone needs you, we're stronger together. His words resonated deeply, prompting tears, cheers, and prolonged applause. By the time he concluded, the room buzzed with energy, attendees exchanging contact information and brainstorming ideas for collaboration. Back home, Elijah continued to balance his newfound role as a public figure with the rhythms of farm life. Spring brought new growth to his fields, while autumn painted them in hues of gold and crimson. Neighbors stopped by regularly, bringing fresh produce or homemade pies. Children played tag in his yard, laughing as they chased each other beneath the towering oak tree. Despite the accolades and attention, Elijah cherished these simple moments most of all. They reminded him of why he fought, for the joy of living, loving, and belonging. Yet the passage of time also brought reminders of mortality. One crisp winter morning, Elijah woke feeling unusually tired. His joints ached more than usual, and his breathing seemed labored. Concerned, his granddaughter Jessica insisted on driving him to the doctor. Tests revealed signs of congestive heart failure, a condition exacerbated by years of hard work and stress. Though the diagnosis worried him, Elijah refused to dwell on it. "I've lived a full life," he told Jessica, squeezing her hand. "If my time is coming, then I'll go knowing I did everything I could." True to his word, Elijah kept pushing forward, determined to leave a lasting impact. He partnered with lawyers and activists to draft legislation aimed at protecting vulnerable landowners from exploitation. He collaborated with historians to document untold stories of Black farmers and their contributions to America's agricultural heritage. And he mentored young leaders, instilling in them the importance of authenticity and integrity. "Be who you are," he often told them. "The world doesn't need more pretenders. It needs truth-tellers." By the following summer, Elijah's health had declined noticeably. Still, he insisted on attending a community gathering organized in his honor. Held in the town square, the event drew hundreds of people: friends, family, supporters, and strangers alike. Tables laden with food stretched across the space while musicians played soulful tunes on guitars and fiddles. At the center of it all stood Elijah, seated in a chair draped with a quilt sewn by local women. People lined up to thank him, some crying openly as they recounted how his story had changed their lives. When it came time for Elijah to speak, the crowd fell silent. Leaning heavily on his cane, he rose slowly, scanning the sea of faces before him. "Thank you," he began, his voice soft but clear. "Not just for today, but for everything you've done to keep this movement alive. This isn't my fight, it's ours. And as long as we stand together, we'll keep moving forward." With those final words, he lowered himself back into his chair, visibly exhausted but content. That night, surrounded by loved ones, Elijah passed away peacefully in his sleep. News of his death spread quickly, sparking tributes nationwide. Flags, flew at half-mast in Ridgewood, and candles flickered in windows across the South. Social media overflowed with memories and messages of gratitude, as people honored the man who had dared to speak truth to power. Obituaries hailed him as a hero, a trailblazer, and a symbol of hope. But Elijah's legacy extended far beyond memorials and eulogies. In the years that followed, his influence continued to shape movements for justice and equality. Schools named scholarships after him. Parks bore plaques commemorating his contributions, and countless individuals carried his lessons in their hearts, passing them down to future generations. His farm, preserved as a historical site, became a sanctuary for those seeking inspiration and renewal. In the end, Elijah Johnson's story wasn't just about winning a court case or saving a piece of land. It was about the enduring power of humanity, the belief that love, faith, and determination could overcome even the greatest challenges. As long as people remembered his name, they would remember the values he embodied: courage, compassion, and an unshakable commitment to justice. And in remembering, they would carry his spirit forward, ensuring that his fight and his dream would live on forever.